Overpower has been completely changed going into Season 2, and the Bloodlance build is changed more than any other. The resulting build is unlike any Necromancer build I have ever worked on. Its damage, its tankiness, its mobility, everything is different than any other Necro build. On top of that, this build is the ultimate balancing act. The different aspects, the different skill tree setups, exactly how you play and move around in packs, all of that has a very high impact on the result of your build. Don't worry though, in this video we're going to break it all down and I'm going to teach you how to get those results. I've managed to clear Nightmare 100 with this build, but when I first started I was struggling to do 70s. This build is nothing like what I expected going into the season. Let's start by talking about the cornerstone of the damage of this build, the Banished Lord's Talisman. This talisman is going to give it up to 120% damage multiplier when it overpowers crit. Now we're going to combine this with the aspect of Grasping Vines on a two-handed weapon to easily cross 100% crit chance. This means that the Banished Lord's Talisman is just a straight up 120% damage multiplier. Because of the amulet, and because we're now running a two-handed weapon, you'll notice that we've lost 2 offensive item slots. This means that our offensive slots are now extremely competitive, as Overpower has a lot of good slots. As a result, we really don't want to run a resource generation aspect on our rings, and this is where the new unique Tybalt's Will comes in. This is a unique pair of pants that has a damage multiplier and resource generation every single time we proc Unstoppable. Now these pants have some downsides, and we're going to talk about how to proc the Unstoppable later, but one of the major downsides of these pants is the lack of defense rolls. The rolls on these pants kind of suck. To compensate for this severe loss in tankiness, we're going to have to run the ultimate defensive package. I'm talking about the Bone Storm with Shielding Storm, and we're going to have to spend another one of our precious offense slots in order to run the aspect of Ultimate Shadow to turn our Bone Storm into a die. If you've played Necromancer before, you're very familiar with this interaction, where our Bone Storm is going to hit enemies every second, and it's going to apply a dot. And every tick of the damage and every tick of the dot is going to give us a barrier. And then we're going to combine this with the aspect of Disobedience, allowing us to easily have this aspect fully stacked all the time. So we're going to be constantly getting barrier, we're going to have a huge amount of armor from the aspect of Disobedience, and because of the way we've set up the Paragon board and some other things we're going to get into later, we're actually going to manage to resistance cap ourselves as well. Now, the rolls on your chest piece are extremely important because of these limiting factors of our tankiness. It's very important that your chest piece has total armor, damage reduction while fortified, and damage reduction from close. This is because we're going to get damage reduction while fortified and damage reduction from close from other sources, and we want to stack those two values as high as we possibly can. Remember, we have the unique pants and the unique amulet, so we're missing some vital defensive rolls. Now, you've probably already realized a major problem with this setup, which is, how the heck do you get 100% uptime on Bone Storm since our defensiveness is so reliant on it? Now, this is where another new unique comes in, the Flicker Step. Flicker Step has a lot of amazing things about it. First of all, these are boots with movement speed, which is always wonderful, and they are boots with damage reduction from close. This is not a roll you can normally get on boots, so this is a big deal. On top of that, the unique effect is really what we're after. Every time we evade through enemies, our ultimate cooldown is going to get reduced by 4 seconds, up to a total of 10 seconds if we evade through 3 enemies. This is a crazy amount of cooldown reduction, and this in combination with the aspect of Osseous Gale, which again is another one of our precious offensive slots, and it was very hard for me to concede that slot, but we have to do it. We need the extra uptime of Bone Storm. The aspect of Osseous Gale is going to cause our Bone Storm to consume nearby corpses to increase the duration of Bone Storm by up to 10 seconds. And Flicker Step, combined with the aspect of Osseous Gale, actually very easily gives us 100% uptime on Bone Storm with very little else. Just have cooldown reduction on your helmet, those two aspects, and you're good to go. There's something you might be noticing here. We have damage reduction from close on our boots, we have damage reduction from close on our chest piece, we're running the Bone Storm setup, which has to only hit melee enemies, and the Flicker Step requires us to evade through enemies in order to reduce the cooldown on our ultimate. And I'm here to tell you that Bloodlance is now a melee build. When we get into the Paragon tree, you're going to see that we're actually taking Territorial, which is going to give us additional damage reduction from close enemies. On top of that, we're also going to be running the Vampiric power, Prey on the Weak. Now, with Prey on the Weak combined with Metamorphosis, whenever we evade through enemies, we're going to apply Vampiric Curse, and while enemies have Vampiric Curse, they're going to be vulnerable. And this is actually going to end up being a melee build. We're going to be running around right on top of packs, we're going to be evading through them, and we're going to be applying all of our debuffs. This is a big separation from Bloodlands builds in the past. In the past, they were deep range, absolute max range, shooting enemies off the screen, but that setup simply doesn't work anymore. Now let's talk a little bit more about Metamorphosis. Now remember Tybalt's Will. Every time we gain Unstoppable, we gain Resource. Metamorphosis is every time we evade, we gain Unstoppable. Now this sounds really powerful on the surface, but there's this drawback here. Because it says when you gain Unstoppable, this means if you already have Unstoppable and you gain it again, it's not actually going to give you the resource. This means we have to wait for Unstoppable to fall off before we evade again to gain the resource. So, Metamorphosis at level 1 gives Unstoppable for 2 seconds. At level 3, it gives Unstoppable for 4 seconds. You can see the problem here. It's actually better not to level your Metamorphosis in terms of resource generation. That being said, I have a level 3 Metamorphosis, it still works fine, but if you haven't upgraded it, don't. Blood Lance, whenever it hits an enemy, will leave the lance inside of that enemy, and whenever you attack again, it's going to deal Blood Lance's damage to all enemies who have a lance in them. And this is where the aspect of Hungry Blood comes in. Each time that we cast a Blood Lance, we'll cast an additional Blood Lance, and it's basically going to double the rate at which we lance enemies. Now, this aspect isn't a massive damage increase in single target, but in AoE, it's going to allow us to ramp much quicker. I know that this build is a lot of information and it's a lot of new stuff, but hopefully everything's making sense, and we're going to be moving on now to the skill tree. And unfortunately, the weirdness doesn't stop. For our basic skill, we're going to be taking Reap. Now, the Reap is going to give us damage reduction, and it's going to give us corpses. On top of that, the AoE resource generation of Reap is crazy, and this is why we're running it. The corpse is really useful for corpse tendrils, for consuming it with Osseous Gale. It's just really useful, and the damage reduction is invaluable. We're going to be putting 5 points into Blood Lance. Remember, with the new math of Overpower, we want to absolutely maximize the damage of Blood Lance, so we're going to put 5 points into it. And then we're going to be going up to Supernatural Blood Lance, which will cause every 6th cast of Blood Lance to overpower and give us a Blood Orb. We're also going to be taking 3 points into Imperfectly Balanced. This is going to give us a nice damage multiplier on the Lance, and unfortunately will increase the Essence cost, but the damage increase is worth it. We're going to be taking Blood Mist, going all the way to Dreadful Blood Mist. So Fortify is extremely difficult to generate in this build when you have none. Once you get the ball rolling, it's very comfortable, but a lot of times, especially when you're first starting this build, is extremely uncomfortable to play. So for this reason, whenever we first start a dungeon, we're going to pop Bone Storm straight into Blood Mist, and we're going to try to fully fortify off of the Blood Mist and get a giant barrier from the Bone Storm, as we discussed previously. We're going to be putting 3 points into Death's Embrace. As we discussed before, this is now a melee build, and Death's Embrace is invaluable in melee builds. So we're going to run it. We're going to be putting 3 points into Amplified Damage for a 12% damage buff, and we're going to be going Decrepify to Abhorrent Decrepify. Now, Decrepify in this build isn't as good as it is in other builds, but the cooldown reduction is still useful. The biggest thing about it is the 20% damage reduction. This is a huge reason why we're running it. It's going to give us a lot of tankiness. Moving on, we're actually going to be putting 3 points into Gruesome Mending. This might sound weird, but this build actually can really struggle to keep its health up, and Gruesome Mending can actually make or break the build here. We're going to be putting 3 points into Transfusion. This is going to give us extra Blood Orbs, and the Blood Orbs are going to give us Fortify as well as health, so this is really important. Cleansed Blood is going to give us an additional 18% damage. Tides of Blood is going to give us an additional 30% damage, which is pretty wild. And then Drained Vitality is going to give us a chance to fortify on hit. You can see that Lucky Hit is a little bit important between Drained Vitality and Transfusion. I would definitely suggest that you get some Lucky Hit on your rings. We're going to be putting 5 points into Corpse Tendrils. The uptime on Corpse Tendrils is really important, and we have to put 5 points into it because our boots and our necklace are both uniques, so we can't get ranks of corpse tendrils like we would in other builds, so we have to go 5 points. And again, this build is very weird, so we're going to be running blighted corpse tendrils for additional blood orbs. These blood orbs provide some much needed healing and fortify. And our ultimate skills, we're going to be running standalone. Standalone, as we've discussed many times before, is the best damage reduction passive in the entire game. 18% for 3 points. Absolutely crazy. Memento Mori is also extremely powerful. It's going to give us a 60% bonus to our sacrifices for skeletal warriors and mages. This represents an increase in crit chance and an increase in overpower damage. Bone Storm, all 3 points. So Bone Storm is going to give us 15% damage reduction, which is amazing. And it's going to give us the 20% crit chance. Remember, we want a lot of crit chance because of our necklace, the Banished Lips Talisman. So the extra crit chance from Bone Storm is actually really useful. Finally, we're going to be running Rathma's Vigor. Rathma's Vigor is going to give us guaranteed overpower on our blood skills, and that cooldown on it is going to get reduced whenever we're healed by blood orbs. So this is by far the best passive. None of the other ones are even competitive. For our Book of the Dead, we're going to be running Skirmishers. So the Skirmishers are going to give us a 5% crit chance. For our mages, we're going to be running Bone Mages. The Bone Mages are going to give us 25% overpower damage multiplier. Pretty self-evident. Finally, we're going to be running Iron Golem. So the Iron Golem is going to give us a 30% crit damage multiplier. You can run the Blood Golem for a little bit of tankiness, and remember, this will give us a slight amount of damage too because of the overpower, but the Iron Golem is going to represent way more damage. Our Vampiric powers are core to what makes this build function. As we already discussed, you need Metamorphosis. We're also going to be running Anticipation for 20% cooldown reduction on Bone Storm. This is a vital piece of the 100% uptime. We're also going to be running Sanguine Brace. So Sanguine Brace is going to represent a nice amount of Fortify generation, as we're going to get Fortify every time we kill an enemy. On top of that, it's also going to give us some very important critical strike chance. Remember, we want as much crit as possible. Sanguine Brace is very good. Now, Prey on the Weak, when combined with Metamorphosis, is going to give us 100% uptime on Vulnerable after we evade through enemies. And it's going to give us a nice damage multiplier. So, this is overall very good damage increase. The final Vampiric power is your Flex slot. When you're pushing for Nightmare 100 dungeons, I suggest you run Resilience, because you're going to get chunked. This build will struggle slightly with tankiness in Nightmare 100, but Resilience will push you over that edge. However, if you're doing lower level content, or you're farming, or you're bossing, or whatever, run Blood Boil. This is because every 20 seconds you get a guaranteed overpower. The extra effect from it, those volatile bloods, I don't know why they're even in the game. Just get rid of them. They look really cool though, so that's fun. But we're running this for the every 20 second guaranteed overpower. Our Paragon board, we're actually going to spend a little bit more time talking about it than we normally would, because I think it's really important. Now remember, Resist All is now an amazing stat. Armor is still useful, but Resist All is much more valuable. On top of that, because we're playing Overpower, additive damage sources aren't as useful as they are in other builds. For an example, if you look at this node, like right here, this magic node is 22.5% additive damage, whereas this node is only 6.3%. So we're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on as much Resist All as possible. We're going to look for some armor, and we're going to not be looking for additive damage because the additive damage of Overpower is so high. So with that in mind, our first glyph is Territorial. This is going to give us 10% damage reduction from close enemies. We're also going to grab all of the armor nodes here. Going into the Bloodbath tree, we're going to be taking Bloodbath for the 35% damage, and we're going to be running Darkness here. Darkness is going to reduce the damage that enemies deal every time our shadow damage ticks. That damage is coming from Bone Storm. Up here, we're going to be running Scent of Death. This is either going to give us damage reduction or a damage multiplier. Either way, it's pretty nice. And we're going to be running the Blood Drinker glyph here, which will cause our blood orbs to fortify us. Now, I am grabbing this Shadow Resilience passive here, but this is dependent on what defenses your rings roll. If you look at your rings, you'll notice that they roll Resist All and one specific element. If you don't roll Shadow, pick up the Shadow here. But if you do roll Shadow, we're going to talk about what to do. But basically, over here, you're going to pick up this Poison Resistance. It's very strange, but this is where we're at with the game. Okay, moving on. We're going to be running Blood Begets Blood. with the Undaunted passive. This is going to give us 10% damage reduction based on how much Fortify we have. This is a very important amount of damage reduction, and Blood Begets Blood is just going to straight up be a 15% damage multiplier. The final tree is Flesh Eater. Whenever we pop Bone Storm, because of Osseous Gale, we're going to get this buff. You can, if you time your stuff correctly, time it so that your Corpse Tendrils goes off right at the same time that you're popping Bone Storm. This represents a huge burst, but it is a little bit awkward to play around. I do suggest you learn how to do it because it's very valuable. Our node here, our glyph here is going to be Sacrificial, which is going to increase the resist all nodes, and it's going to give us a straight up 10% damage multiplier. Now, I know this build has been a lot, but hopefully it was explained at least decently well. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as possible. And if you want to check out my stream, the link is down below. My name is Ruse Cruz, and I'll see you guys in the next video.